So to begin, thank you so much to both of you for being here to speak with the Narwhal about these transboundary watershed issues. And I know right now we're sort of, by the time this gets to our audience, we'll probably be out of the limbo of the U.S. election, but I'm sure for any Canadian, watching this election, we're acutely aware of what happens in the United States, affects our politics, it affects our environment, and same for Canada down to the States. So it's a real pleasure to have the two of you here, especially representatives from both sides of the border, to speak with us today. So to begin, I might ask both of you to just really quickly introduce yourselves.
Rob?
Yeah, hi, I'm Rob Sission, a U.S. Commissioner on the International Joint Commission. I grew up and spent most of my life in the Great Lakes region in the state of Michigan, but relocated to Montana a few years ago with background in nonprofit conservation work and local government.
And hi, my name is Merrell-Ann Phare. I'm a Canadian commissioner. I'm sitting right now in about 50 meters from the Red River, right in Manitoba. I live in Winnipeg. So I'm a lawyer, and I have spent my entire legal career working on Indigenous law and environmental law, particularly water rights issues. And I've negotiated transboundary water agreements in the Mackenzie River Basin, and also have worked with another hat for almost 25 years in an Indigenous environmental organization called the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources. So I keep juggling hats. That's what I do.
Amazing. And Rob, can you give us just a little, explainer? What exactly is the International Joint Commission?
Our two nations, actually the U.S. and Great Britain, back in 1909, signed the Boundary Waters Treaty. And that was designed to head off disputes of use and diversions of water along the Canadian-U.S. boundary. Of course, the role of Great Britain has shifted with sovereignty to Canada some time ago. And so in the Boundary Waters Treaty, the International Joint Commission was created. And the commission is a binational body, 3 U.S. commissioners, 3 Canadian commissioners, with a staff, support staff to help us. And we stand by and ready for the two governments to ask us to resolve a question or to look into issues for them. Initially, the only 2 bodies of water or systems that were specifically named in the Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909 were the Niagara River, because locals in Niagara Falls, Canada, and U.S. were concerned that if water was diverted from that river, it would ruin the aesthetics of the falls and thereby the tourism industry. So that was included in there. And then also the St. Mary Milk River system, which is shared by Alberta and Montana, and which has been in the news this year because there were some infrastructure failures there and impacted irrigation in both sides of the boundary. But since then, we've been asked to take on a number of issues, including the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. One that your readers in the Northwest or in the Western Canada might be familiar with was the Trail Smelter issue that came up many years ago. And so we've been very active, and people can find out more at ijc.org.
Great, thanks. And Merrell-Ann, can you talk a little bit about what exactly we mean when we say transboundary watersheds? Like, where should people's brains be going on the map?
So when we first started, like under the treaty refers waters that cross the boundary. So think of everywhere the Canada-U.S. boundary is. So either a water that flows from one side to the other side, or that's actually situated on the boundary. So think of a lake right at the border that's sitting across, and the Great Lakes are a perfect example of that. That's how it really started, was thinking about those specific waters. But since that time, we have come to recognize, basically everybody knows that thinking beyond specific locations like that of water to the land that waters are in, which is called a watershed. It's basically everywhere that water flows to one direction is what is the actual definition of a watershed. So for practical purposes, plain language, if you think about everywhere the boundary is, you're kind of looking at the land that those rivers and lakes that cross the boundary, the land that they're situated in, including the people that are there, the ecosystems that are there, so the plants and animals and various aspects of water health, including quality and quantity, rate of flow, surface water, groundwater. You're really trying to look at the whole package in order to make a good decision in the thing that we have jurisdiction over, which is the boundary.
And increasingly, groundwater is becoming the attention level to groundwater is increasing. I think there are 5 or 6 major aquifers that straddle the boundary between the two countries as well.
It's interesting to think about, since this commission was founded and some treaties were signed. Not only has our understanding of ecological impacts and ecological systems really evolved, but so too has our sense of who ought to participate and who should have a voice in the way that watersheds are managed and the way that projects and their impacts are sort of measured. And I know for the commission, you've mentioned that working more closely with Indigenous communities and Indigenous peoples is going to be a bigger part of looking at these watersheds. And can one of you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure, absolutely, I can. Well, first, I just wanted to mention that we, for the first time in Canadian history, I think in the IJC's whole history, right, Rob? We have an Indigenous representative on the IJC commission. So that our commissioner, Henry Lickers, who's a Seneca, Haudenosaunee, he's a commissioner. So that's a huge milestone for the commission. And I, of course, have worked in these issues my whole life and feel strongly that the solutions to our water issues flow from having the people at the table that both have rights and have knowledge and are impacted by the waters. And so Indigenous people are key peoples that have been excluded from that decision in many times, most of the time in the life of the IJC. And so we, many years ago, long before any of the current commissioners were on the commission, have begun a whole number of projects with Indigenous people, and some of the most interesting ones that we can talk about are, for example, in the Rainy River, Lake of the Woods area, where we partnered to do some fascinating studies together, incorporating traditional knowledge and Western science together to figure out better ways to manage, for example, in that situation, hydro dams, how to change the flows and at which time of year in order to protect sturgeon spawning grounds, and which are critical to the treaty rights of Indigenous people there and are part of their sustainable livelihood. So that's a good example. And that work has been going on for some time. I think what the commissioners are also interested in, though, is doing more of that, for sure. But thinking about it consistently across all of our boards and across our programs. How do we be systematic, consistent, transparent about the role of Indigenous peoples in the decision making? Because that's the fundamental, that's kind of the last step, right? Is reconciliation, which matters a lot in Canada. It's framing, we do a lot in Canada. I think only happens if you can reform institutions, decolonize them, and that happens by having Indigenous people have a voice in them. So that's my particular take on it, but the commissioners all agree that figuring out with Indigenous people how to work together to achieve IJC's mandate is a key priority.
And if I can add to that, one of my dreams for the IJC, I don't think it'll happen during my tenure here, but hopefully we've planted the seed, that the governments will eventually give the IJC the ability to create international watershed boards across the entire transboundary, so there's not 1 inch on the boundary where we don't have a presence, where we can create a watershed board that's very similar to one you might have in a domestic watershed that doesn't cross the boundary. Just because water a watershed spans the international boundary, it's no reason why it shouldn't have a binational board that meets to discuss issues, problems, share data, provide transparency, plan strategy for that watershed, and maybe address and head off problems before they rise to an international issue or to an IJC reference. And I see those boards as a fantastic way to bring Indigenous voices to bear on our work and on the management and protection of water along the entire transboundary. And I'm very excited about traditional ecological knowledge. We've been dominated at the IJC and elsewhere by Western science. And the more I learn about traditional ecological knowledge, the more I'm just amazed at what I didn't know and the wisdom that Indigenous people can bring to the table. And I also, we've had the opportunity to meet representatives from First Nations in Canada that represent, their nation is 300, 400 people, and they live in an isolated spot on an isolated body of water along the transboundary. And I view Indigenous, whether it's First Nation, Métis, or tribal here in the U.S., I view them as an early warning system for us because they're living in the waters, on the waters, by the waters, and across the entire transboundary. And if we have this framework of international watershed boards with very strong Indigenous representation, we will learn of potential issues before they get out of control, hopefully.
Thinking about some of the watersheds that we can look to now, where some of these problems have been difficult to control. Our readership is really familiar with the ongoing problems with selenium and some other pollutants in the Elk Valley watershed, for example. That's a watershed that I love how it flows into the Koocanusa Reservoir. Koocanusa, Kootenay, Canada, USA. I mean, how much more explicit could you be about the fact that this is a shared body of water? And despite a fair amount of attention and concern from government and the company that works there, Teck, about this problem, we are seeing ongoing concerns and the problem, there being challenges with resolving that problem. And for a lot of people who, I've interviewed, for example, on this issue, and folks from Montana too, they say, when you look at the way that mining's going on up there, you have these huge exposed waste piles, and they're the source of this contamination. And it looks like that contamination is going to be making its way into that watershed and the ecosystem for potentially hundreds of years. So not only are these places, are we thinking about them as shared and sort of expanding our sense of our geographical imagination, but I think we're also beginning to think in longer time scales. And this is definitely something that is inherent in traditional Indigenous knowledges that's not necessarily in the Western mindset. So I'm curious for either of you to speak to some of the challenges that we're seeing in a place specifically like that watershed in the Elk Valley, and what is the commission's role, and how does the commission sort of view and understand that problem right now?
I can start with just the role of the commission, and then maybe Rob can talk more specifically about his views on the situation. So in that situation, of course, a company like Teck would be regulated by the federal and provincial government in Canada, or if it was a similar situation in the US, it's the domestic governments that regulate the activities of those kinds of companies. And the IJC has no jurisdiction over that. What we do, though, is we become involved under the treaty if there's an impact on waters along the transboundary or from one side to the other, and that is the case here. And so what we can do, and we have only certain levers in our toolkit at the IJC, because we're not a government. We're created by governments. Our levers are, we can alert governments to problems that we see. We can recommend that we be given a reference that helps, and a reference is a process where we are asked by governments to study the issue and come back with recommendations to try to solve the problem or prevent conflict. And that's usually a multi-year process, very expensive, but it really gets at the science and traditional knowledge is behind the issue, and it gives us an opportunity to involve basically all of the local people and provide a final report to government that sets out research findings and recommendations. We have asked for a reference to deal with mining issues and water quality issues, different conversations, but basically coming at the issue from two different directions. And we're waiting to hear on that. That's been a longstanding request that we have made. And so the references come to us. Technically, one government can give us a reference, but that has never been done in the history of the IJC. It is generally, the practice is both governments have to agree to give us a reference to study something. And so we would be very interested in doing a study that encompassed this and other mining issues to try to deal with this vexing issue. Have yet to be asked, though.
And so just to touch back on a point, that IJC has officially requested an invitation to do a reference.
Oh, we have definitely formally and informally expressed that there's a big opportunity for us to research what's happening in this area and to provide recommendations and to head off future conflict. Yes, we have done that.
Yeah, and one correction, Merrell-Ann, is that there was one unilateral reference when Canada made a reference on the Windsor hum.
Oh, really?
There was a noise emanating from Detroit that the citizens of Windsor complained about, and the Canadian government made that reference to the IJC to look into it. And I guess they never got to the bottom of it, and eventually the hum disappeared or what have you. But so
Thank you.
funny.
Some great lore there.
Yeah. So the Elk River, I think coal mining's been there for a long time. So as with a lot of industrial processes, we didn't know what issues might occur or might be there because we just forged ahead with the way things were done. And obviously we know now that selenium could be an issue. We just released a long awaited document on the human health impact of selenium. Not targeting the Elk River Valley or Tech, but just in general, what selenium impacts on human health could be. We do know in that watershed, it's having an impact on fish reproduction and populations. And we also know, and I want to stress that the two governments are working very closely on this. Our federal governments are working together to try to shepherd the solution and fixing the issue. I do know that I believe I saw some news this week that Tech is vastly ramping up its water treatment capabilities in the very near future. I expect them to come online soon. So that's all good. I mean, you put yourself in Tech's position. I think if they had a magic wand, they would fix the problem right now because they want to stay in business. They want to hire people and make money for their shareholders. So I think they're working diligently towards it. I'm an angler. I love fly fishing, and so the Elk River Kootenai system is close to where I live, and so it's something I keep an eye on. And I think this is one of the watersheds where we could benefit from a watershed board, because when you have a situation like this, there's a lot of distrust. Like, is the other side doing enough? Are they paying attention? Are they sharing us all the information? Does the company really care or not? And I think if you had a watershed board in place, if we had one in place historically, there'd be relationships already built, trust, lines of communication built, where I think this would flow a lot easier and might be less controversy, less anger, and more, my favorite phrase, more rowing the boat in the same direction to try to find a solution and implement it.
Can you say a little bit more? I mean, I'm curious even myself, what exactly you see a board doing? Can you just like really break it down? Like, if there was a board that who's designated to work on these kinds of issues, like how would that board intervene in the Elk Valley in particular?
Well, yeah. In general, a Kootenai system board, because that's the Elk River is part of that. We would have local community leaders and members on, NGO representatives on there. Um, Hopefully, someone from the mining industry involved, state, local, federal government officials all together, and citizens who are concerned. And primarily, it would be communication and relationship building, because that's how you address problems, and that's the best way to do it outside of more regulation or lawsuits and things like that. So again, that's where I see a watershed board playing into it. Specifically in this case, if the governments someday give the IJC a reference here, they could ask us to consolidate and manage or oversee the water quality testing, to give everyone confidence on both sides that the measurements are accurate and true, and protocols are being followed. They could give us a reference on, because as you mentioned, because of the tailing piles, this problem could be with us for 1,000 years. So they could give the IJC a reference at some point, just so there's a permanent binational body that's keeping an eye and monitoring the situation, for the hopefully for, well, I guess, for centuries. But so there are specific things that a board can do, but that's, the governments have to tell us what that is. And I when I talk about the watershed board, it's more communication, and building trust and relationships on both sides of the border.
Which you could see both in terms of the Indigenous governments having a role, Indigenous peoples having a role, that's a huge piece. But remember, part of the reason we've suggested a reference on this topic is because there may be governance reform that's required in order to prevent these kind of problems in the future, particularly given the role of local governments, the role of Indigenous governments, et cetera. And so thinking about it from the scientific and Indigenous knowledge side is one thing. What is the science actually telling us, and what can we do? And there's a technology aspect to it, but there's also a governance aspect, in addition to, as Rob pointed out, for sure, the ongoing communications. And a reference could help us kind of frame out what would be the key things that a watershed board would do. Normally our boards, particularly the old ones that haven't changed much, they look at water quality and quantity. They don't really look at anything beyond that. Mm-hmm. And so this is a much more complex and diverse problem than that. And that's where watershed boards come in, because they have a mandate to look at all the aspects of the problem, and to try to protect transboundary waters.
It's interesting to bring up the governance elements of these problems and potential problems that could plague watersheds. I'm thinking of another transboundary watershed shared between BC and Alaska, up in Northwest BC, and this is a place of some of BC's biggest mines, most remote mines. One of BC's probably most infamous mine, the Tulsequah Chief, which was closed and sort of passed around between different companies, and it was never really formally and properly cleaned up and remediated, and led to these 60 years of leaching into a river that is flows directly into Alaska, a salmon-rich river. Looking at our sort of neighbors in Alaska, this is a situation where you actually have Indigenous groups and conservation groups looking very specifically at the way British Columbia manages mines, the permitting of mines, the way that it requires specific remediation or cleanup, or even having enough money set aside to clean up a mine when the project is done and dusted. A lot of the rules that sort of surround that, we're finding our brothers and sisters in Alaska really looking in detail at that in BC, saying, BC, you haven't modernized your mining laws for 100 years. Maybe it's worth looking at. And of course, that's one of those governance issues that seems to come up quite a lot when we're talking about BC mines in particular. It's just that our permitting regime is quite up to date. Was the Detroit hum? Was that?
Pardon?
I was wondering if that was the Windsor hum.
No, that was just received an alert that there's a wildfire south of my house. So.
Oh, interesting. Snow and wildfire.
Yeah.
Welcome to our new region.
Last year we went on a fact-finding trip to Southeast Alaska and British Columbia because of interest in Alaska had contacted us and said, "Hey, you need to come look at this because we think this could be a big problem." And so we went up. We met with state of Alaska federal and local officials, NGOs. Then we went across and met with British Columbia and Canadian federal officials, and we met with mining company officials too to gather facts. We don't have a reference in the area, but we used our alerting function to let the governments know that there is, the Chief Tulsa mine, as we know, is leaching into the watershed. Mount Polly, which didn't directly affect international waters or shared waters, but that's the example that I think a lot of people in Alaska are worried about with the bigger mines in British Columbia on that would feed into the Taku, Unik, and Stickeen rivers. And I agree. I think people on both sides are talking about those laws and regulations to better protect the watersheds. I have faith that British Columbia and the Canadian federal government will continue to make progress in that. For me, I look at salmon as this century's version of bison from the 1800s. Now, in the 1800s in the U.S., the U.S. government made the conscious decision to try to eliminate bison in order to basically control and stamp out indigenous culture. We're absolutely not making the conscious decision to try to impact salmon negatively. But in my mind, standing by and not being proactive in pulling out all the stops to protect the really rich salmon rivers and waters could end up doing the same thing. If one river system loses its ability to reproduce salmon, we're going to see entire indigenous cultures disappear. Tlingit, Haida communities along those rivers and coastal areas. So it's something I'm very keenly aware of and spend a lot of time thinking about, reading background on. Hopefully it will never arise to an IJC reference because the governments, through regulation and whether that's a carrot or stick, will resolve it before it becomes a problem.
If I could take the step just out of my IJC hat for one moment and say, like, IJC certainly does not weigh in on domestic legislation and whether it's out of date and needs to be reformed or not. As Rob said, what we can really do is alert as to a problem and if asked, have a reference and do a study in that area and provide some recommendations. But I would say that I know there are some indigenous nations in that region who work with the mines and are in support of mining. There's not 100% consensus on what is the best path here. And to me, that's the sign of the need for governance reform domestically. I think finding out how to build legislation that rely on indigenous laws to better protect the salmon in accordance with what their worldviews are, plus British Columbians, that's the governance reform moment. That is kind of the reconciliation moment. That's the conversation I think that needs to have in order for that to happen. I would agree with Rob that from what we know and from our investigations, Canada and BC are talking at length about this on an ongoing basis. And like Rob, I really hope they're very successful in that. But I think those conversations must also have to involve Indigenous nations that are directly impacted as well, like at a governance level, sort of a government to government table to try to truly resolve this issue.
And I know as we're wrapping up here, you participated in the creation of Canada, one of Canada's new sort of signature Indigenous protected areas with the Watersheds Park. And so in some ways you've had experience of what it's like to participate in a very collaborative process that is not just about shutting down industry or just about protecting landscapes, but really about looking holistically at an area and trying to find a way, in concert with the Indigenous peoples who've stewarded these lands for a very long time, how to think more holistically about a place and its carrying capacity for industry, and caribou and fish and all of these things together. And so I wonder if you have any kind of parting thoughts on the nature of those kinds of negotiations and that kind of planning that's happening now that maybe we haven't seen so much of in the past. Are we sort of tipping over to a new way of thinking about ways to plan for our landscapes?
Yes, I certainly hope so. And there are excellent examples like that one and many others, in particular coming from the Northwest Territories, because I was chief negotiator up there for that government. And we did amazing work together with Litzel First Nation and the Acacho people, who wanted, very unusual, a protected area, but they wanted it their way. They wanted to be able to continue their livelihoods. They recognized the need for some still industrial activity in parts of it. And, it's an Indigenous protected area. It's driven by their needs and for sustainability, but recognizing that they're within a broader context. And I don't know any Indigenous folks who don't, they want livelihoods, but they want control over what that looks like. And so the conversations were really, largely about governance and about decision making. How do we make decisions about what happens here? Was by far their most important long-term goal. I remember them specifically saying that to me. And so in the Northwest Territories, they have a tradition of that. They have written territorial laws together, co-drafting, where they actually all hands on the pen write it together, laws that Indigenous people feel impact them. They want to not just be consulted. It's not about consultation at all. It's about sitting there as governments writing it together. And that kind of thing can be done. Collaborative governance tables, there's nothing that stops that except our desire to sit at a common table, bring our jurisdictions to the table and figure out what we can do together. That's what Watersheds was. And that's what co-drafting is. And there's a number of initiatives across the country that are like that. And to me, that's absolutely the future. That's where the solution is for decolonizing our current institutions and finding a path that is actually a path that will sustain us into the future.
Amazing. And Rob, do you see that the IJC potentially playing a role in those kinds of negotiations potentially moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, your question framed part of my view of international watershed boards. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we have a number of places along the transboundary where there really is a single Indigenous nation, but because of this artificial boundary, they're divided in two. Our colleague Henry Lickers, he always talks about, well, there's a Mohawk council in Canada side, there's one on the U.S. side, then there's the traditional government that just ignores the boundary and treats us as one nation. Mm. And so I know in Southeast Alaska and British Columbia, there are Indigenous people on each side of the boundary that can wave across and say hi to aunts and uncles and cousins and things because they're related, they're from the same culture, maybe the same First Nation, first tribe. And because it's international, binational, the IJC would certainly have a role in helping that collaboration and that collaborative governance.
Amazing. I want to thank you both so much for your time and for speaking to the Narwhal and our audience about these issues. And your work is fascinating, and we will continue to follow along with what happens. And thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. It was wonderful to be here.
Yeah, and thank you to the Narwhal too, because you guys do just phenomenal work in reporting. I really enjoy reading your publication.
It's awesome to hear. Thank you.
Thank you.